Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories, and welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives this one away, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I just celebrate the fact that films get made. I think it's really hard to do, and I want to salute the people who've managed to do so. Without further ado, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films then that I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going to go back to 2013. I'm going to play you one of my favourite clips that I might just have cut one of the record-breaking number of F-bombs out of, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
You did.
When did I
did.
say
You
that?
said TNA. It's TNA. All right.
I know you're upset about the dinner, and that makes sense because we did spend too much money. But I said TNA.
Don't tell me what you said. I heard what you said.
Dad, he said TNA.
He did. He said TNA.
Absolutely no question.
Yeah,
I heard it.
I'm trying to.
I'm getting this
Fucking
close.
sweating. Dad,
I'm getting
relax.
this close.
That's what I'm saying. I want you to open up more, Max.
I can kill you.
Why do you
kind of
hold it in? Why
what
do you,
ki-
Max? Why do you hold
That's
it in?
it. That's it. Get the fuck out.
That then, as you probably guessed, is a clip from 2013's The Wolf of Wall Street, directed by Martin Scorsese, screenplay by Terence Winter, based on the book The Wolf of Wall Street by Jordan Belfort. The cast for this one led by Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, Margot Robbie, Matthew McConaughey, Carl Chandler, a couple of film directors in there, Rob Reiner you just heard from, Jon Favreau as well, Jean Dujardin is in there, John Bernthal. And, I mean, it's a heck of an ensemble, but then also it's a heck of a story, really, isn't it? Now, the origin of it, as you might expect, was Jordan Belfort himself. This is based on a true story that Jordan Belfort was christened the Wolf of Wall Street in a newspaper profile of him. And he was a very famous, whichever you choose to do, figure in the financial markets that led to him heading, I think it's a mild spoiler, but I think you can probably see this one coming, heading to prison for, let's just say stuff that is discussed in some detail in the movie. It's a very, very much story of excess, and he put all of this into his own memoir that when he came out of prison he wrote the book, which was called The Wolf of Wall Street, and that memoir quickly interested Hollywood. I mean, the story had been good tabloid fodder anyway, even in the build-up to his arrest and ultimate conviction, but this was a battle of two movie stars that soon emerged, Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, both Pitt and DiCaprio had production companies. DiCaprio has Appian Way, Brad Pitt has Plan B. Both of them have all sorts of prestigious projects, and they found themselves both bidding for this particular project. In the end, back in 2007, it was DiCaprio that prevailed, and he secured the rights to the book and to Belfort's story. It cost $1 million to get them. It quickly got Warner Brothers interested, and it quickly got Martin Scorsese interested as director. By this stage, DiCaprio had worked with Scorsese a few times on films like Gangs of New York, on The Aviator, and on The Departed as well. And so Warner Brothers came in quickly, not least given that The Departed had won an Oscar, won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. Scorsese won Best Director, of course. And so it was in the aftermath of that, yes, it wanted to board Martin Scorsese's next project. So this looked like it was coming together. So DiCaprio and Scorsese then took Jordan Belfort's book to a writer. They selected Terence Winter, who'd created HBO's hit series Boardwalk Empire, of which Scorsese directed the first episode. He was also a former equity trader at Merrill Lynch, so he knew the financial markets, he knew Wall Street as well. And he, as he told Tom Shon in the book Martin Scorsese, would see the story of the Wolf of Wall Street along the lines of a Casino or Goodfellas kind of structure. picture, very much in Scorsese's ballpark. He duly got to work with a kind of rise and fall story with excess and addiction at the heart of it, and the script that he penned quickly got attention in Hollywood as well. That it's you may have heard of The Blacklist, which is the annual vote of the best unproduced scripts in Hollywood, and The Wolf of Wall Street duly made it 2007's Blacklist, but that didn't necessarily accelerate getting the film actually made. Because even though he'd won Warner Brothers a Best Picture Oscar for The Departed, Scorsese was still locked in the studio process here. Now, I've covered The Departed on a previous podcast, and Scorsese did have frustrations because he was making a film with a studio on that one, that it went through various bits of testing that big studio films had to do. And ultimately, Scorsese decided he'd had enough of trying to get the film made at Warner Brothers. He told Richard Schickel in the book Conversations with Scorsese that he, quote, wasted 5 months of my life, unquote, trying to get The Wolf of Wall Street made with Warner Brothers. And so he eventually jumped ship and he inked a lucrative deal with Paramount Pictures to make films over there, and he focused instead on making Shutter Island with Leonardo DiCaprio in the lead, and The Wolf of Wall Street found itself back in limbo. Not surprising either. If you look at the ingredients of this one, A, it was going to be very long, and that was always regarded to a degree as box office poison. B, it was no way going to have anything other than an R rating in the US, given the excess in the movie. I'm treading light if you've not seen it. And so it was just a massive gamble that wasn't going to be cheap to realise either. So off they went. They went to make Shutter Island, which they duly did. But in 2008, I mean, Warner Brothers was losing interest in the movie, but DiCaprio, through his production company, was still trying to find other directors for it. That he kept in touch with Scorsese throughout this point, that inevitably, because he was working on the same film as him, but nonetheless kept putting The Wolf of Wall Street in his ear. Now, Warner Brothers, a story popped up that in 2010, Warner Brothers, which was still involved at that point, tried then to lure Ridley Scott in to direct the movie. Now, Ridley Scott had worked with Leonardo DiCaprio on the film Body of Lies, and that had gone okay. But the problem was there was a scheduling problem building up there. A very familiar story for Ridley Scott. At this point in 2010, he was developing the Alien prequel that would become Prometheus for 20th Century Fox, and that was a priority project for the studio. There were other things going on in Scott's life as well. He was, as always, a very busy man. DiCaprio, meanwhile, he committed to make a film with Clint Eastwood, J. Edgar, and so fitting things in was getting more and more troublesome. And in the end, Ridley Scott walked away. Scorsese had his deal with Paramount anyway, and Warner Brothers just decided to cash out, decided to drop the project. It went into turnaround, and The Wolf of Wall Street found itself in limbo. Not for too long, though. Because let's move forward to May the 11th of 2011, which in the Hollywood trade press, it was announced that a company called Red Granite Productions, and boy are we coming back to them, headed by a man called Riza Aziz, had acquired the project from Warner Brothers. That this was now going to be pretty much an independent movie of real scale. So the script from Terence Winter was firmly in place at this point, and in the 2011 report that popped up at the Hollywood Reporter, it stated then that Scorsese could be lured back to this because he had completed Shutter Island, he's working on Hugo at the time, but he was interested still in making this one. Red Granite, meanwhile, it had this ambitious idea of producing 4 or 5 films a year. So it had just done an underrated comedy drama called Friends with Kids from Jennifer Westfeldt, which at that stage was a feature it had completed. It would go on to do Daddy's Home and Dumb and Dumber 2, and I'll briefly touch on those a little bit later as they fall into this story, bizarrely. But what Red Granite did was it managed to tap into a source of funding. And it was able to offer to DiCaprio and to Scorsese the kind of deal that a studio would never do. A $100 million budget for what was going to be an R-rated picture with a long running time. And on top of that, Scorsese could have full creative control of the movie. So we moved to 2012 when DiCaprio told Scorsese at this point, and by this time he'd finished making Hugo, he had a gap in his schedule. DiCaprio said, "I don't think we'll be able to do a movie like this too many times in the future." He described it as old school, really independent filmmaking on a larger scale, and Scorsese was persuaded. He was in. He'd always retained an interest in telling this story, but this was the opportunity in front of him. He signed on the dotted line. Universal then picked up the non-US rights to the movie, again, albeit with no creative control. And the film was pretty much set to go. This was actually going to happen. So inevitably, DiCaprio, who was also producing, was going to play the role of Jordan Belfort. And Belfort, who'd reinvented himself as a motivational speaker at this point, well, the two of them spent weeks in their company whilst preparing for the film. That DiCaprio wanted to know everything. In particular, he wanted to know the little details. All those excesses that were part of Belfort's life. And those excesses, not only could DiCaprio then bring to the role, but they could also be soaked into the screenplay, which would continue to evolve. I'll come to that shortly as well. Now, there was very much a legal problem with this, that this was a film about people who were still very much around and people with, let's just generously say, bank balances. As a result, there's a degree of fictionalisation that went on, and names of certain characters were changed to protect the movie. I did a podcast a while ago on Scorsese's film Casino, and Casino predated the book version of that story, and as such, all the legal clearances were incumbent on the film rather than the book. Now, with The Wolf of Wall Street, Belfort's memoir was already out there. Conversely, this was a big target for potential legal action, and people in the aftermath of the film's release would say that it took significant liberties with some of the things that actually happened. And so the wisest thing seemed to be at least part fictionalise some of the characters in this. Casting wise, well, it fleshed out. I think one of the most bizarre casting stories was Julie Andrews nearly took on a role in this one, and if it wasn't for an injury that she had, she would have been in it. There's a role called there's the role of Aunt Emma in the movie, and when she had to drop out, that's the one that Joanna Lumley would ultimately take on. Jonah Hill, this was a real breakthrough role for him, that he'd proven he could do dramatic stuff previously, but this was really a step up, and Scorsese wanted to meet him, but Hill apparently insisted on doing an audition. He had to convince DiCaprio and Scorsese that he could and should audition for this one. He hadn't auditioned for years for a role, but he desperately wanted the film. He duly auditioned for the movie and got the role, and would take a scale rate to do the film. He would talk about this long after the movie's release, that he ultimately would get something like $60,000 for making this film against DiCaprio's many tens of millions that he took home. Alan Arkin is someone who turned the film down. He had a choice of two movies to make. That he was offered the role of Jordan's father in The Wolf of Wall Street, and he was offered a role in the film Grudge Match starring Robert De Niro and Sylvester Stallone, and he took Grudge Match instead. So Rob Reiner duly came in. You heard that clip from him right at the start of this particular segment. Margot Robbie, meanwhile, landed her first major role in a Hollywood movie as Naomi, again a slightly fictionalised version of Jordan Belfort's second wife, and a major character in the film. And the rest of the ensemble duly fleshed out in time for August the 8th, 2012, which was start of production day. Now, this was Scorsese's built into many of his films the option to improvise and playing with material. That was very much the case here, that things were still able to be added as filming got underway. And I go back to that Tom Shun book looking at Scorsese's work, and DiCaprio was talking about how Jordan Belfort had mentioned to him that at one moment there was a chimpanzee on roller skates in a diaper that was handing out tickets to all the stockbrokers. So Scorsese replied, "That's great. How do we get a chimpanzee?" "I don't know." "All right, somebody get on it." And so Scorsese then called his longtime producer, as she's described, Emma Tillinger, and she told him there's a chimpanzee who can roller skate, but it's in Florida. And the next thing DiCaprio knew, on set in the film, there is a chimpanzee. He's going around the sales room in the movie on roller skates. That is the independent nature of a well-resourced film very much at work, I think. Now, that room for improvisation was particularly welcome to both Jonah Hill and Matthew McConaughey. Now, McConaughey came in to do, you heard right at the very start of this podcast was a bit of McConaughey for you there. They were given real latitude with their roles. And McConaughey turned up on, I think it was only the second week of filming that he came in to shoot his sequences, and then he was gone. One of the ways, though, that Scorsese deals with improvisation in his movie, as much as he encourages it, if it's going in the film, what he apparently then does is he asks for those moments to be typed up and put into the formal screenplay document. So McConaughey's infamous throat hum that you heard, which again was done very, very early on, that was McConaughey's creation. It duly found its way into the script after he'd filmed it. DiCaprio wasn't shy of improvisation either. There's a moment where he starts throwing lobsters, for instance. That came to him in the moment. They went with that. They felt that worked. And then, how spoiler light do I go? There's a moment with Quaaludes. I think I can say that, where DiCaprio's character Jordan Belfort takes them and they start to mess with his head. And so this was very much an improvised moment that DiCaprio would spend what's described as days crawling around on the set trying to get to his Lamborghini. And as Scorsese commented with delight when he saw this, what he did was almost Jacques Tati or Jerry Lewis. And I mean, it just goes to the fact that the actors were really willing to go for it with this one. There is, I don't think, again, it's a massive spoiler to say that there's quite a lot of cocaine that goes up people's noses in The Wolf of Wall Street. And obviously they didn't use cocaine, but what they did instead was use vitamin D powder in its place. And I didn't appreciate this till I started looking it all up, that Jonah Hill actually ended up in hospital in the end because he was putting so much vitamin D up his nose. So, you know, there's a sage warning all round there. There's quite a lot of discussion that I found online about what to shoot this on as well, that there was some toing and froing because Scorsese had made the film Hugo digitally. Would he shoot The Wolf of Wall Street digitally, or would he do it on film? He did ultimately shoot it primarily on film, although there was some digital work in there as well. The movie too would go, I mean, in its American shoot was primarily based in New York. It would go overseas too, to Switzerland and Italy, and filming would wrap up at just over 4 months after it started shooting on January the 12th, 2013. But it was going to be a really lengthy post-production on this one, that the film was, because so much improvisation had been done, that Scorsese and his regular editor Thelma Schoonmaker had to really work to find the shape of the film in the editing room. There was an awful lot of material that they had to wade through and play with, and it was very much a 7 days a week job to try and get the film into shape on deadline. It was known that Paramount wanted the movie in cinemas in time for an Oscar run, and that meant it had to be released by the end of December in 2013. It was going to push that absolutely to the wire, and in fact it was pushed back right to as far back into December as they could possibly go. And I remember when the Oscar nominated films came around that year, it was about the last one to debut and the last one to premiere. But then they were fighting so much in the editing room to get it right that the first cut of The Wolf of Wall Street came in at some 4 hours, and they knew realistically they needed to get it under 3. And in the end, the final running time of the film, that did indeed cost $100 million to realise, is 100, depending which source you go, 179 minutes or 180 minutes. Either way, 3 hours. At that point, Scorsese's longest film to date, although he would comfortably beat it by the time The Irishman came round many years later. I will come to The Irishman in a future podcast. Part of the problem that Scorsese was having with the cuts was the inevitable battle with the Motion Picture Association of America, the ratings board in the US, that Scorsese was contractually obliged to deliver an R-rated cut because otherwise American cinemas would not play the film if it got the dreaded NC-17 rating. If you get an NC-17, you can't get in major multiplexes in the US. The video stores, remember them, they wouldn't be that keen on stocking you either, although that was less of a consideration, I'd suggest, in 2013. But nonetheless, he had to get an R, and so a lot of F-bombs had to be taken out of this one. There's what you could politely describe as an orgy scene that takes place on a plane. That had to be cut back quite a lot, that the MPAA doesn't like Nookie, and as a result, Nookie had to come out of the film, although again, there's a reasonable amount you get for your money here. So Scorsese and Schumacher just kept refining and refining, but they also kept in just a kind of uneasy and off-kilter feel to some of the editing, just as certain sequences had been shot in the film, in fact, because what Scorsese was doing was trying to depict the story very much from Jordan's increasingly frazzled perspective, that as the film goes on and Jordan's abusing more and more and more substances, his head is getting more and more all over the place, and Scorsese wanted the visual presentation of the film to reflect that. It's also worth noting as well that there was quite a lot of CG post-production visual effects work done on The Wolf of Wall Street. In particular, I mean, go back and watching the film, I'd just forgotten how tremendous the yacht scene is when the yacht gets caught up in a storm. That, I mean, if you go back to 2000, I think it was, there was a film called The Perfect Storm, which I don't have an awful lot of time for, but it did have this tremendous effect of a boat that was up against, let's just say, a very, very sizable wave, and that was the poster, that was the trailer for that film. In The Wolf of Wall Street, a similar, arguably more effective moment is just one sequence in the movie of which no fuss is made, but conversely it's a really memorable, excellent and well executed sequence. The film then would be complete in time for its release. It premiered on December the 17th, 2013 in American cinemas. It would qualify for its Oscar run. It had originally been set for November the 15th, but those Motion Picture Association of America cuts and also trying to get the runtime down meant that they did push the film back fairly late in the day, really. The late release date also, though, was aided by the fact that, I think this is pretty well known fact, that The Wolf of Wall Street was the first film distributed by a major Hollywood studio in the digital format, that it didn't go out to cinemas on 35mm film and instead it was released entirely digitally. The response to the film, well, it was and remains quite mixed, that the people who really love The Wolf of Wall Street really love it. And I mean, it is a very hard film not to enjoy, even considering the subject matter of it, that 3 hours pretty much flies by. The ongoing debate over the movie, and this is something critics and audiences picked up over the time, is whose side are you ultimately supposed to be on in the film? Are we supposed to be laughing at and judging the character of Jordan Belfort, or are we celebrating him and the way that he treats people? And so this really it became a bit of a football for that, really, and there was quite a lot of backlash against the movie, but also there was an awful lot of enthusiasm for it, and inevitably this just helped the story of the film as it soared into American cinemas. So it got its wide release in US cinemas December the 27th to the 29th 2013. It opened in fifth place with an $18 million opening weekend, again for a 3-hour film with an R rating. The movies it was up against, well, the other big opener that week actually was The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which opened in 7th place with 12 million. Keanu Reeves' 47 Ronin opened that same week with 9 million, and what do you know, Grudge Match, that opened in 11th place with a $7 million opening weekend. Top of the box office was the second Hobbit movie, there with Frozen and Anchorman 2 making up the rest of the top three. But The Wolf of Wall Street had significant awards momentum on its side, and it would hang around the box office for a long time. It would still be in the top 5 nearly a month later. But even when it was dropping, I mean, if we go forward to the box office, the 17th and 19th of January, when it knocked to 9th place, still bringing in 7 million a weekend for, again, this particularly long film where there was no shortage of competition. The Oscar run certainly helped it a lot as well, and by the time the movie left US cinemas, it grossed 116 million in the States alone, added another 275 million outside of the state. So this one came in at nearly $400 million at the box office, which was the top grossing film of Martin Scorsese's career. And it remains commercially a real high point, and yet on paper it's one of the ones that you would think is probably one of the hardest to sell. Now, it turned up on lots and lots of top 10 lists as well, and as you might expect, The Wolf of Wall Street also interested the Oscars, that it turned, I mean, when the Academy Awards came round, it got nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Didn't win any of them, though, that particular year. I mean, those particular Oscars, the Best Picture winner was 12 Years a Slave, but The Wolf of Wall Street was very, very much in that conversation and was a hit. Everyone happy. A successful movie. That surely was that. Little bits of trivia followed that it would turn out that The Wolf of Wall Street would end up in the Guinness Book of Records as the film with the most F-bombs in it to date. It would also be banned in a couple of countries. It would have 45 minutes taken out of its cut when it premiered in the United Arab Emirates. But profits, independent company, lovely. Yeah. So let's go back to Red Granite, because the big post-release story concerning The Wolf of Wall Street was to do with that production company. I have to tread very carefully here because there are lots of very rich people who have been involved in lots of litigation here. So I'm going to give you a without prejudice overview of what happened next, because Red Granite found itself implicated in an investigation of a scheme that had led to huge amounts of money allegedly being siphoned from a development fund based in Malaysia. And the allegation was that the money that funded The Wolf of Wall Street, and also that perhaps underpinned films like Dumb and Dumber 2 and Daddy's Home, had come from a fund where, let's just say, that money perhaps shouldn't have come from. So this ongoing scandal would, incredibly, lead to the former Prime Minister of Malaysia being implicated in it with damage to the government of that nation. Now, it first surfaced in 2014, this scandal, the year after the film was released. And Deadline reported at the time of a 25-page filing on March the 25th that alleged violations of the much mob-used RICO Act, it said. And it described how Red Granite principal Riza Aziz is the stepson of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and he's been accused by the likes of former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown's sister-in-law, you following this, of financing his company through, quote, illicit funds from that country and others. Now, Red Granite and Aziz denied these claims, but the investigation was ongoing. And so by 2016, Red Granite was then cooperating with a US federal investigation into, quote, its money relationships. So the Wall Street Journal reported that Red Granite was cooperating with a federal probe which was focused on whether $155 million may have been moved through, quote, a Malaysian government fund known as 1MDB and into Red Granite in 2012 through a circuitous route involving offshore shell companies. So Najib Razak, who's the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, had set 1MD up, Aziz, his stepson, and by July 2016, assets connected to Aziz had been seized. And all the while these stories were coming up, it was the Wolf of Wall Street that was involved in them. By 2017, this had gone over to the US. It wasn't just Malaysia. It wasn't just affecting Malaysia. The US Attorney Office's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section started talking about taking action to seize the rights to Dumb and Dumber 2 and Daddy's Home. I've seen Dumb and Dumber 2. I think they're quite happy to have that, really. Now, there was never any implication, to be absolutely clear, that DiCaprio knew of any of this. And he, in fact, apparently got in touch with the investigation early, well before he was asked, and returned an Oscar that he'd been given by Red Granite. This Oscar had originally been won by Marlon Brando and had been given to him as a thank you gift for his work on The Wolf of Wall Street. DiCaprio cooperated, and there was no implication there of any wrongdoing on his part. But the Red Granite story would rumble on. And so later that year, so we're in 2017 now, a settlement was reached with the US government, but investigations continued in Malaysia. And in 2018, Najib Razak, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, was arrested, and Aziz himself was summoned to appear as well. DiCaprio, as it rumbled on even more, would find himself testifying in front of a grand jury in the US by the start of 2019. 2019 also saw the arrest related to the Wolf of Wall Street of Riza Aziz. Charges were then dropped in 2020 when he reached a settlement in Malaysia, quote, in exchange for the return of over overseas assets reportedly worth $107.3 million. And in the aftermath of that, Belfer is now trying to sue to get the rights back to his story, making all sorts of allegations and whatnot as well. The aftermath of The Wolf of Wall Street, certainly in the Hollywood trade press for a while anyway, overtook the story of what was really a one-of-its-kind funding of an independent film in this way, certainly of this size. And we look now at how an organisation like Netflix will fund a film. Now, it will give David Fincher an awful lot of money and a lot of creative control. But most of the films that Netflix puts across, it has a lot of creative control over. And so this really was something of a rarity that The Wolf of Wall Street managed to get through at this moment. It allegedly didn't get through by the, let's just say, the cleanest of means. But it exists, it happens, it's back with Paramount. And in fact, at the point this podcast has been recorded, Paramount is putting it out on a 4K disc, which they've not sponsored me to say, I'm sad to say, in December of 2021. And perhaps when that comes out, the whole debate again will raise over just which side is The Wolf of Wall Street on. Which brings me to the halfway point of this particular episode of Film Stories. So I'm going to do a couple of parish notices before we get on with the rest of the episode. I have a Film Stories magazine, issue 29, is deep into production and is going up for pre-order very, very shortly. You can find all of my magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk. Hopefully got some Film Stories news coming your way shortly. If you want to listen to me waffle in person and you're listening to this in time, I am live in Birmingham again on the 24th of November 2021 at the Midlands Arts Centre, where I'm doing my Movie Geek live show, where you basically get 90 minutes of this just with some guests and some even worse jokes than I usually tell. If you do like this podcast and you do like Film Stories, I mean, we're fully independent and there's 3 ways you can support us if you don't mind doing that. Financially, any money that comes through our Patreon is then reinvested into Film Stories. You can find that at patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to everyone who's supporting me there. But also, if you like this podcast, please just subscribe to it wherever you get your podcast from. Please do. Also, ideally leave a hugely positive review. All of that stuff helps independence enormously, and I can't thank enough all the people who've done that for me already. Which all brings me then to the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. This time I'm going to zip forward to 2019. Again, I'm going to play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this one, the other side of this.
Hello?
My name is Hutch Morgan. I'm calling from WWE. We'd like both of you to come try out for us.
It's all fake anyway, isn't it?
What?
Sorry about that.
It's The Rock! We're huge fans.
Thank you so much.
What advice would you give us? We want to be the next you.
What are your names again?
My name.
It doesn't matter what your names are. You walk around here interrupting The Rock, you like you haven't seen the sun in 20 years. You like you just stepped out of Oliver Twist. Please, sir, may I have some more advice, sir? You want some advice? Here's The Rock's advice. Shut your mouth.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Got it.
That then was a clip from 2019's delightful British comedy Fighting With My Family, directed by Stephen Merchant, written by Stephen Merchant as well, based loosely on Wrestlers, The Wrestlers Fighting With My Family by Max Fisher, and starring Florence Pugh, Lena Headey, Nick Frost, Jack Lowden, Vince Vaughn and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who you just heard a little bit from at the end of that one. And in fact, the story of this one sort of starts with him because it's based on a true story. It's based on the story of the Knight family in Norwich. And Dwayne Johnson was in the UK filming a sequence for the movie Fast and Furious 6 all the way back in 2012. Now, this takes some imagining, but let's go for it. He was in his hotel one night during the filming of it, and he just started flicking through the TV channels. And I've just got like this image of The Rock in a travel lodge or something, just having a quick butcher's to see what's on the box. And he landed on Channel 4. And Channel 4 that night was showing a documentary by the name of The Wrestlers Fighting With My Family. Now, this was a pretty warts and all documentary that told the story of the Knight family of Norwich, a family who happened to be united by their love of wrestling, and stand out amongst them was WWE star Paige. And so Johnson, of course, has form when it comes to wrestling, that being his background, and he got really interested in this documentary. And as he told The Hollywood Reporter in the end, he said, back in 2012, I was in my hotel room in London, stumbled across a documentary on a local UK channel. It's Channel 4, Dwayne. Not only was I intrigued by this loving and wild family, but I also felt it's the kind of narrative that would make an amazing movie. And he added that the knight's journey is a universal one that all families are familiar with. He said he related to the central character and a wrestling family on such a personal level, and it means so much that I can help tell their story. Now, this particular film story that I'm telling then intersects with what I'd call a generally forgotten film that Johnson had made a couple of years before. Now, that film was Tooth Fairy. So Tooth Fairy was built out of the old idea of get an action star to play against type. So you've seen these before. We've got Vin Diesel in The Pacifier, Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop, Sylvester Stallone, Stop or My Mum Will Shoot. While all those were being developed, Tooth Fairy first came up as a vehicle, as a potential for Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think he went with Junior in the end around that time. It was what I remember reading a trade press report that City Slickers director Ron Underwood was possible to direct it back then, but it bumbled its way through the Hollywood system, and The Rock eventually picked it up. It was an early producing credit for Jason Blum as well. It's not a credit he's particularly fond of being reminded of. If you've listened to the 2 episodes I've done with Jason Blum, you'll note that I take every opportunity to remind him of this. And it would be fair to say Tooth Fairy wasn't that good a film. And I've got a theory on this, that if you've got, those of you out there who've got kids, there comes a point where you show kids films for the first few times, and the first few films you show them, no matter what you show them, they just love them because it's all new and exciting. And eventually they find their first film that they didn't like, and Tooth Fairy was the first film my eldest didn't like. He just sat through it and just no. Nonetheless, on that movie, Stephen Merchant was in the cast of this one, and an unlikely friendship of sorts was formed, and The Rock and Stephen Merchant stayed in touch. Now, Merchant at this point in his career, well, he'd sprung to fame off the back of The Office with Ricky Gervais that they'd written and directed together. They'd also made Extras, and then the pair of them had come together for their co-directorial debut, an underrated British film called Cemetery Junction. I've got a lot of time for Cemetery Junction. And so Merchant was scoping possibles for a second movie to direct himself. But Johnson then, going back to that documentary, he put in a call, and he rang Stephen Merchant up and he said, would you be interested in developing the Knight's story as a possible feature? Now, Stephen Merchant gave a lot of interviews around the time of the film's release, including one to me, and he was very open about the fact that he knew absolutely nothing about wrestling at this point, that he was interested in directing. He just completed his first and only stand-up comedy tour, Hello Ladies, and he decided he didn't really want to do another stand-up comedy tour, and Julie hasn't, but he was actively on the search for something else. So he sought out the Channel 4 documentary and watched it, and he told me that, quote, I expected to sit there and slightly sneer at this family, which I probably did for the first 5 minutes, but then I got very invested and very interested in them as people. I got swept up in it, the dynamic between brother and sister. And so he was homing in on a couple of things. That it was the sibling story really that was his eureka moment there. Again, without spoiling the film, I don't want to go fully into what it is, but there was something in that he saw could really work, and there was the core of a story. There's also a Rocky story to this, a Rocky story in Norwich hadn't really been done before, and so he got to work on the screenplay. Now, as with The Wolf of Wall Street, there was some degree of fictionalization that went on in the adaptation of the real life story to film, but one or two liberties taken. But also what Merchant was very, very keenly aware of was that the screenplay to his film had to work for non-wrestling fans as well as wrestling fans, and he really bore that in mind, that anything to do with wrestling would need to be explained to some degree. It just had to be a broad open film for this to work. As part of the process of researching this, he went and met the Knight family in Norwich, and he was quite taken with them fairly quickly. And as he said to me, almost immediately, the father said, yeah, I was in jail 3 or 4 times before I was 21, and his wife chipped in, mainly violence. And Merchant liked them. He liked how candid they were. He liked how accepting of their past mistakes they were. He also really liked their working class background and the working class story, the success story that they were at the heart of. Now, Merchant too had come from working class origins, and this was just the kind of a story that he liked the idea of putting on the screen, that he could set it away from where films are traditionally set in the UK as well. And it was this Norfolk Rocky style story that was coming together with Dwayne Johnson involved involved, I mean, that kicks open a lot of doors. And Channel 4 came on through Film 4 very early on in the development of the movie. Merchant also told me that when he was writing it, he knew really he wanted to direct. That he quoted an analogy that Ricky Gervais once told him. It's just like, why would you build an Airfix kit, let someone else then play with it? And he's always appeared to be fairly conscious that if he's writing something, he wants to step behind the camera and be involved in the creation of it beyond the script. He also knew that this was a British success story that hadn't really been celebrated. That this central character of Paige, she'd gone on to do tremendous things in wrestling, but nobody in the UK outside of the wrestling scene really knew who she was. There, as he described to me, there were no huge profiles of her in the Guardian or anything like that. It was just a very, very quiet British success story. And so he's put this script together, and it started to come. It started all to slot into place. And so in 2017 came the announcement that the film was on. And with that announcement came the news that Florence Pugh, then a complete unknown, and Jack Lowden were in the lead roles. The announcement got the most traction by the fact that The Rock was going to produce the film and also take a cameo role in it. Lena Headey and Nick Frost were coming in to play the parents of Pugh and Loudon in the movie. And then very quickly it was revealed that Vince Vaughn was coming in to do a cameo role too. The casting of Pugh, it has to be said, is one of those moments in movies that is an absolute masterstroke of timing, because at this point she hadn't had her major breakthrough at all. I mean, Lady Macbeth was her breakthrough role, but that hadn't happened. She was just plucked from the audition process, and they saw dozens of actors for the two lead roles, but they just saw something in her, and she was cast, and it proved a decision that ultimately paid heavy dividends for the movie. So with the announcement in 2017 also came the confirmation that Stephen Merchant was going to write and direct the film. And in fact, it was just after filming started, the movie went to the Berlin Film Festival, where the rights to it were being put up for sale, and MGM spent what was then seen as an eye-watering $17.5 million for the global rights for the film. WWE Studios are also on board, Film 4 still involved, and really that sum was a reflection of the fact that one of the biggest movie stars in the world, Dwayne Johnson, was heavily involved in this project. So it was on the 15th of February 2017 that filming on what became known as Fighting With My Family began. And up front, it's fair to say it was the tricky stuff, because it opened up in America. That was where the shoot began. And the first thing that Stephen Merchant had to get in the can was a major WWE scene in the movie that happens towards the end of the film. And this is the bit where Florence Pugh's depiction of Paige has to get into the ring at a huge televised WWE event for her big moment, for her big Rocky moment in the film, and shoot scenes. And to do this, they needed to capture the authenticity of it. And so they tapped into Dwayne Johnson's WWE contacts and the WWE Monday Night Raw show. And they agreed, they negotiated a 1-hour window with 20,000 fans in the arena waiting for the main event. They negotiated a 1-hour window where they could shoot the sequences for their movie in front of a real crowd. No extras. It's a crowd of people who came along to watch the wrestling. They had to get a lot of footage in 1 hour, and they also needed to get the crowd on their side, because if the crowd looked disinterested or booed or anything like that, well, that would be incredibly difficult in the edit room. Nancy Richardson edited this one, a name check to her. So what Merchant did was he asked The Rock, he used his special weapon here, he asked The Rock to go warm the crowd up, which he duly did. Now, he did with a caveat. He explained to Johnson before he stepped out in front of the crowd, we've only got an hour. Please don't go on for too long, because there's a lot of footage to get. Yep, fine. But as Merchant described to me, when Dwayne gets in front of a wrestling crowd, that's like Elvis has come back to life. It would be fair to say The Rock did not entirely listen to what Merchant had asked him to do. He did around 20 minutes of ad-libbing with a rapturous crowd. And so by the time he got off the stage, and Merchant said he's to this day the only person who's been screaming at The Rock to get out of the ring at a wrestling match, They had 40 minutes to get the material. Florence Pugh, this was the first stuff in the can she needed to get it. If they didn't get the material, that's going to leave a massive hole in the film and would create a scheduling problem when they tried to, just to try and get it at a second attempt. So in front of 20,000 people, Florence Pugh stepped into the ring. Stephen Merchant admitted he was petrified. Florence Pugh absolutely on fire and completely delivered. And with that opening in the can, there was rocket fuel behind this. There was confidence. Those opening shots were there. Not the opening shots in the movie, but the opening shots of the production. And so then the film decamped to the UK for shooting in Great Yarmouth, in Norwich. And Merchant was very keen to use authentic locations to give the film a grounding. And so, for instance, they were shooting at Norwich Market by April of 2017. And he talked about the importance. These things are memorable. If you go to places that aren't often seen on screen, that these things tend to stick in the head a little bit more than if you just show the same location over and over and over again. Once they got the scenes in Norfolk, the final round of filming saw them head to Los Angeles to capture the last bits of footage. And on this one, I don't have a firm end date for when production wrapped up, but it's fair to say that it was done by the end of spring of 2017. The edit then got underway and the picture was locked by January of 2018. But the thing is with Fighting With My Family, it was an $11 million budget film to make. So that MGM distribution deal had technically put it into profit already. Nonetheless, this was a low-budget British comedy at heart that just happened to have one of the biggest stars in the world in a cameo role. That was what they knew that they were ultimately selling. And so it was then the case of they got to find a place in the schedule to release it, which goes to why there was a 1-year gap between the picture being locked and it ultimately premiering, showing for the first time. That search for a release date was prolonged to the point that Merchant could go away and shoot an entire role in the film The Girl in the Spider's Web while that bit was going on. Now, the film was being tested whilst in that intervening year, and it was being enjoyed. They certainly weren't getting feedback that said they had to go back to the drawing board. They knew they had a film that was working on their hands, and I really like this film a lot. When he did have a final cut of it, Merchant did tell me about how he put on a private screening of it for Paige herself, that he went to visit her at a WWE venue where she was performing in the US, and he just left her in the room watching the film. And she texted him about 90 minutes later, once the film was done, and asked him to go back. And when he did go back, he found her in floods of tears and absolutely loved it, but trying to hide the fact that she was in floods of tears because she's a wrestler, and that's not necessarily the look that she was going for. Nonetheless, the people involved in the film were really taken with the movie. But there was that conscious thought that this is still a film that's going to need a lot of luck. A really delicate one, really, is how MGM looked at it. And it had to fight hard to find a slot that would work. So it stayed. I mean, I was writing preview features of films that are coming up for a long time. And this one stayed on the list without a release date. I just remember it just kept popping up. But it was finished, it was wrapped up, but it wouldn't have a release date for months and months and months and months. Now, the closest we got was when a date was announced of September the 14th, 2018. But then even that got delayed a few months beforehand, pushed to March of 2019. In the end, though, what they did was they did a smaller platform release, really. They went to a film festival as a surprise film just to try and get some noise and really to put the film out into the world. And so off it went in January of 2019 to the Sundance Film Festival. Now, this is nearly 2 years after the movie had wrapped production. Lionsgate, incidentally, had distribution rights in the UK at this point. And the film was, The Rock and the team all went along to the Sundance Film Festival debut, and the response to it was strong. I mean, this was appreciating that it was working within the parameters of a sporting movie. It was praised heavily for being funny. I think it is really funny, for really capturing the emotion of the story as well, and just a big, broad, enjoyable, warm comedy. And so there was good word of mouth to go with on this. There were certainly the poster quotes ready, and the confidence was there to formally announce that release date in the UK as well, of the 1st of March 2019. As it would turn out, the movie would debut just slightly earlier in the US. It would land on the 14th of February 2019 in the US. That was a small platform release, though. They initially released it in America on just 4 screens. And so actually its opening weekend, it opened in 41st place at the US box office, but with the biggest screen average of the whole chart. That per screen, it was bringing in, $34,000. The number one film that week was Alita Battle Angel, which was bringing $7,500 per screen. And so they were hoping that the word of mouth would catapult Fighting With My Family into a much bigger film. So it opened on far more screens the following week and duly hit the top 5, adding another $7.8 million. The problem it found itself up against was, ultimately, they were sort of pitching it as a sporting family comedy, and the big opener that week was How to Train Your Dragon, The Hidden World, and that took away $55 million. The second Lego movie was in the top 5 as well. And so Fighting With My Family, I mean, it certainly held its own. That much is clear. It was still in the top 5 the week after, and still bringing in money. By the time it had completed its US run, this $11 million movie, and it's worth stating that's how cheap the film was to make, had grossed $22.9 million in the US. It had done another $17.8 million overseas, so a $40 million take in all, and it was a good hit in the UK as well. Not a massive one, but a good hit. But it's also a film that has continued to find its place really on streaming services and on home formats, and has a good number of people who really just fight its corner. I'll leave the final word on this though for Florence Pugh, because the year that she ultimately had that the movie was released was a staggering one for her. This was absolutely her breakthrough year. That in 2019 she was in Fighting With My Family. She was in a short film called In the Time It Takes to Get There, but she was also in Midsommar. She was in Little Women. And this all built on the fact that Lady Macbeth, which had come out in 2016 in the end, just after she was cast in Fighting With My Family, had really put her on the map. But the films that she was getting and the profile she was getting was just absolutely soaring. And more recently, of course, we've seen her in Marvel's Black Widow, which is her biggest box office hit today. But she says of Fighting With My Family, she described her deadline, why it was so important. And she said, I think Fighting With My Family is so crucial for every single action thing I ever do for the rest of my life, because it taught me that I really love it, and actually I'm not that bad at it. I personally would certainly second that. I don't think I'm alone, and I think Florence Pugh has gone on to become one of Britain's finest actors, and Fighting With My Family stands proud in a really, really impressive collection of credits. What she goes on to do next, who knows? I'll certainly be watching, but I suspect I'll also be watching this one a few times again as well. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening. You can get more of my waffle if you can tolerate it on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the Film Stories Project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Website, let me tell you about that, filmstories.co.uk. Every weekday, there's all sorts of film mayhem going on there. That's reviews, features, news, all sorts of bits and bobs. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, there are 35 individual issues, some of which have sold out, of the assorted Film Stories and Film Stories Junior magazines. I'm still making more all the time of those, and your support of independent publishing is hugely, hugely appreciated. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories, and I think that's it really. I think I've talked an awful lot and overrun as usual for this episode. So the most important thing, as always, is you all take care and you all stay well. I'll be back soon with some more film stories, but until then, you all look after yourselves. All the best to you. Bye-bye.